Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolong Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolong is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, a man brutally murders his girlfriend, but was he insane when he did it? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, with my professional co-host, Alice.
I'm sorry, I've been anything but professional tonight, so I don't know what that means. Is that like a subtle dig?
No, absolutely not. That is from Riles, who sent us an email talking about how much she liked our professionalism and suggesting that as a descriptor for you. And Riles, by the way, disagreed with us on Darlie. She thinks Darlie is innocent, but she wanted to write us an email and tell us what a good job we did. And I really appreciated that because that's part of this podcast. You are free to disagree. We want people to disagree. We respect disagreement. This is not a place where you have to have one view in order to hang out with us.
That was a very civil email, and it was the quintessential agree to disagree, but actually saying that without like a middle finger.
Yeah, which is usually what that means. If someone says we're going to agree to disagree. But no, and everybody's been great. You know, there have been a lot of discussions about this on the gallery, which is our Facebook group. And I love seeing people disagree without being disagreeable. And I hope we can continue to have that on this show and in any of the communities around the show. I know there are some, I'm not going to name names, but I know there are some podcasts who have some fans that people might describe as toxic, but those are not our fans. Our fans love to discuss the cases, and we want you to keep doing that.
Well, there's a lot to discuss this time, Brett, because, oh my goodness, this is a brutal murder we're about to talk about.
It is a brutal murder, and one thing that's interesting about this murder is there's no dispute. Unlike some of the cases we've discussed, there's no dispute that the person we're going to talk about killed the victim in this case, Carina Petrache. And this is actually a case out of Canada that was suggested to us by one of our Canadian fans. We're trying to branch out and do more international crime. And when we looked at this case, we realized there were some really interesting legal questions that we could dive into, so we wanted to cover it. And with that, I think that's probably enough introduction. Let's talk about this case. I'm sure this is one that probably is not familiar to a lot of you because, number one, it's from Canada, and number two, I don't think it's been covered that much, but I hope you will find it interesting, and there's a lot of little nuances to this case that I look forward to teasing out. So when 23-year-old Carina Petrache met 27-year-old Farshad Shan Badakashan,
That was really good. I was saying it in my head and you said it like exactly right, I
Okay,
think.
I'm going to leave it that then. At Ryerson University, the two immediately hit it off. Carina was a student at Ryerson in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and she was, interestingly, majoring in criminology, and I'm sure when she decided on that major, she never thought that her case would become the kind of case you might teach in a criminology class. She lived in a room in a building known as the Annex, and Sean lived in a basement apartment in the same building. Not surprisingly, small building, everybody knew each other, and it wasn't long before the two met. And when they did, they immediately hit it off. They became friends, and by March of 2010, they were dating. A fairly normal relationship, a fairly normal way to meet, all things considered, not unlike many others. But whatever honeymoon they experienced did not last very long. There was something dark that lived in Sean, and soon it would rear its ugly head.
Sean had been displaying symptoms of mental illness for a very long time. His mother would later report that when she'd lived with Sean in 2005, she'd even feared for her own life.
And that's 5 years before Sean met Carina.
And typically, without intervention, mental illness isn't something that goes away. So 5 years' time has gone by, 5 years' time for his mental state to be deteriorating. He'd been a kind, quiet person for most of his life, but in his face, his mother saw a looming shadow. She eventually left to find a new place to stay. Her inability to sleep due to constant fear that Sean would come into her room and hurt her finally took its toll. That is frightening for a mother to be so scared of her own son that she actually moves out. And her worst fears actually came to bear. Sean's paranoia had reached a fever pitch. Adriana Mararu was Carina's best friend, and she witnessed firsthand Sean's decline. Almost as soon as Carina and Sean started dating, things became tumultuous. Carina would whisper on the phone to her friends that she couldn't talk because Sean was listening. Sean wanted Carina all to himself, so much so that he never wanted them to leave the house. Carina had friends, though, and she would often go out. Sean stayed home and got drunk. He was, in fact, always drunk. And when she'd come back to her room, Sean would accuse her of going out with other men, calling her a slut and a bitch. These are classic signs of control in a relationship.
And it's really interesting. I've been watching a lot of documentaries on Nexium recently. I kind of fell down that rabbit hole. And when you compare abusive relationships and cults, there are a lot of similarities in how they control people. And, you know, whenever you talk about cases like this, you're talking about cults, you're talking about whatever, people always ask themselves, how could this person have stayed in this relationship? How could they not have seen that they needed to get out? And I feel like it's one of those things when you're not in it, it is very difficult to understand what's going on. And what you're seeing here, like Alice said, these are classic signs of someone who is attempting to control another person. And you're seeing some real signs of alienation, which is something you see in all these cases. And, you know, we're talking about how could you stay in it? Why couldn't you see it? I think it's one of those things we all should ask ourselves. Are we in relationships? Whether it can be a friendship, it can be a relationship where one person is trying to drive everyone else away from us and have us all to themselves. Alienation is a thing. You don't want people talking to their friends. You don't want them talking to their family. You don't want them going out. Because when a person has no one else but you to rely on, it's very easy to control them. It's probably one of the most classic symptoms of an abusive, dominating relationship is alienation. And you can see this here. I mean, Carina is a person who likes to go out. She likes to be with her friends. She has friends. She wants to talk to them on the phone. The fact that she has a boyfriend doesn't mean she can't have friends, but she's already starting the first stages of this where she feels like she has to hide the fact that she has friends from her boyfriend because she doesn't want him to get angry. And whenever she goes out with them, she's showered with abuse. And essentially what Sean's hoping will happen is eventually it just won't be worth it anymore. She'd rather just not deal with it and just stay with him to make him happy. And eventually, as those friends sort of fade away and drop away, she's left with no one she can rely on, no one she can turn to but her abuser. And that's one of the reasons that it's so difficult for people who are in these relationships to get out, because they don't feel like they have anyone who can help them.
You know, it's one of those things that looking in, friends start to notice it, but oftentimes we don't want to interfere in other people's personal lives. But if you see signs of this in a friend who's normally gregarious, who becomes withdrawn because they're afraid of making their loved one mad, reach out to them or say something, because the problem with this alienation is it's incremental. It doesn't all happen in one day, step by step. That's the brilliance of the one doing the alienating. It's a tiny bit each day until all of a sudden you're miles away from where you used to be. You're miles away from connections with other people. And all of a sudden, someone like Carina is on an island by themselves. Watch for this in your friends and don't be afraid to say something. Do it in a loving way. Oftentimes, people on the outside can see it. They're just afraid to intrude because they're usually looking in to a more intimate relationship and they think, well, I don't know everything, but you know your friends. So watch out for your friends.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about Adriana earlier, and you're going to see she was that good friend who stuck by Carina, even though in the end, there was nothing she could do to prevent the tragedy that we're going to talk about. Now, Sean and Carina's relationship, probably not surprisingly, can generously be described as off and on. They broke up and got back together more time than Carina's friends could count. But it wasn't just Carina doing the breaking up. Sean would break up with her as much as she broke up with him, announcing once in front of her friends that they were, quote, done. But for whatever reason, whether this was a manipulation tactic on the part of Sean, or whether or not there was just some sort of star-crossed love between the two, they could not stay away from each other. Now, Adriana, she begged Carina to leave Sean. In a text that was introduced at the trial we're going to talk about, she wrote, "You deserve better. You'll look back a year from now when you're with a great guy and you'll wonder what the hell you were thinking." And, that's probably something we've all told to one of our friends at various times. Fortunately for most of us, the situation wasn't quite as serious as it was here. Now, for a while, it looked as though Carina was going to do exactly that. She was going to break it off with Sean. She was going to move on. And at times, she would even block his number in her phone. But unbeknownst to Adriana, the two made up one last time and even took a trip to Niagara Falls together. But just a few days later, Sean would murder Carina.
On the morning of July 2nd, 2010, Peter Sharina was jolted awake by a fire alarm blaring in the house that he shared with Carina and others. As he walked in the hallway, he was met with a horrible sight. Carina was stumbling down the hallway. She was covered in blood. A thick red line ran across her throat, and the lower half of her body was engulfed in flames. She collapsed into the communal kitchen where other students struggled to put out the fire that was burning her up, and her last words were, quote, "Keep him away from me." The him was Sean, who stood at the end of the hallway like in a horror movie. The fire was licking at his body as well. Now, we'll never know exactly what happened that morning. It was clear that Sean had finally snapped. He lured Carina into a basement room and then lit a fire outside of the door so that she could not escape the attack that he had coming. He stabbed Carina multiple times and slit her throat. Carina fled through the flames and Sean followed her. She would die on the way to the hospital, and Sean would suffer severe burns over most of his body, and he'd spend months in a medically induced coma as doctors worked on saving his life. One of his legs was amputated, and he was permanently confined to a wheelchair. His own mother begged doctors just to let this monster die.
But they didn't do that. They saved Sean's life, and he was arrested, and he was charged with murder, with first-degree murder, as a matter of fact. And this was one of those cases where the defendant's not really going to be able to deny what he did. Everyone witnessed this, and Sean didn't deny it. And what this case would turn on is whether the mental illness that Sean clearly suffered was enough to prevent him from being held culpable for his crime. And we'll talk about what that means, but one thing I want to point out before we move on, this is July 2010. Remember, they started dating in March. That's how quickly this escalated. It's how quickly things went from somebody I know in the house I live in to that person brutally murdering Carina. And I mean, that's shocking that this could go that badly that quickly, and even that is probably a testament to the mental illness that Sean was suffering from.
And it's interesting, in that short period of time, they had already had a tumultuous relationship. That honeymoon period was so short. They'd already broken up and gotten back together multiple times in those few months.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a relationship that was heated from the start, I guess, and obviously didn't get better. I don't really know what to say about it. It's kind of shocking how quickly everything did develop, how quickly it went wrong, how quickly this abusive relationship started, the breaking up, the getting back together. But in those few short months, we went from 0 to 60. So let's talk about the insanity defense. So as I said, the fact that Sean murdered Carina, it's beyond dispute. But Sean is going to argue that he is not responsible for his actions. He is going to argue that he is insane at the time of the murder. So let's talk about the insanity defense. We'll talk about it in the United States. We'll talk about it in Canada, though obviously it's Canada that matters here the most. And where you have to start is something called the McNaughton test. Those of you who went to law school or are lawyers, you've all heard of the McNaughton test, even if maybe you don't understand it. For those of you who don't know, McNaughton was a Scottish woodcutter, and he killed the secretary to the British Prime Minister, Edward Drummond, while trying to kill the Prime Minister himself, who he believed was conspiring against him. He thought that the Prime Minister essentially was responsible for all the bad things that ever happened to him, to the point that he decided the only thing he could do was kill the Prime Minister to save his own life. This went to trial, and, this is in the early 1800s. So, you might think, early 1800s, nobody's going to care that he says he's insane. They're just going to, hang this guy, which is what you would expect to happen for murder at that time in Great Britain. But that is not what happens. In fact, they determined that McNaughton was not guilty by reason of insanity because he could not appreciate that the act he was committing was wrong. And that's the heart of this test. Do you know that what you are doing is morally wrong? So in the case of McNaughton is under a delusion, and it's a delusion that's so strong that he essentially thinks he's acting in defense of his own life when he commits this crime. He doesn't know that what he is doing is wrong. He thinks that it's very right. Those of you who've been with the show since the beginning may remember the case of Billy Woodward that we did way back. I think it was like our 3rd episode or 4th episode or something. And that was another case where the insanity defense was kind of sort of brought out, and the question of whether or not Woodward knew that what he was doing was wrong. And one of the things we talked about is the fact that after the crime, he waited in the middle of the street with his guns down, with his hands behind his head, for the police to arrive. And that's actually a sign that he knew what he did was wrong, because he knew the police were going to come and arrest him. So that's the sort of thing you look for. You're looking for when you decide whether or not someone is insane. Now, as I said, this is a case from the early 1800s. Interestingly, as we're going to talk about here in a second, even though it happened after the United States had become an independent country, the United States and Canada both are something we called common law countries. And the common law is something that has developed over the centuries through the British legal system. So countries that were either affiliated or colonized by the British often have this common law system. So a country like India, for instance, has a common law system. Very different from a country like France.
Right. So in other words, we don't follow just a set of rules. It's not set. You can't just open the code books and know exactly what the law is going to be. It's a rationale and reason builds upon previous cases precedent to develop our common law.
Yeah, I mean, it's very strange. And Alice and I deal with this every day. I mean, every day we are writing things or arguing in front of a court, and our argument is essentially we win because in this other case that has nothing to do with our case, the court said this, right? And the fact that the court said that sometime in the past can be decades, centuries even ago if it hasn't been overturned. Because they said that back then, it's part of our common law, and that controls what we're doing now. And that's the way that we have this sort of continuity in the law. Now, we obviously have statutes as well in the United States, and those statutes often define things, but in sort of weird ways. So you might have a statute, for instance, that makes robbery illegal, but maybe the statute actually doesn't define what robbery is, but there's a common law definition of robbery. I forget all the elements, Alice, but I think it has to be like a dwelling that's inhabited and you restrain the person and then take something from them or something along those lines.
Something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Like burglary has to be breaking into a dwelling at night.
So it's like whether certain things are dwellings, whether a storage shed is a dwelling, whether a car is a dwelling. You can see
Right.
how even if it's written out in the law and you think you meet all the elements, there's a lot of argument to be had around the actual text.
Right. And when you're making those arguments about the text of a statute passed by a legislature, you're going to talk about cases that courts decided in the past to help make that argument. So it's this sort of it's sort of an interesting thing. Some people think that's a bad thing. Some people don't like what they call sort of the dead hand of the law, the fact that people who lived in very different times, very different circumstances, with very different beliefs about a lot of different things, that their decisions are binding us today. Some people don't like that. Other people, and I think I'm one of these people, like that sort of continuity and the idea that the law has developed over the years by this almost trial and error way of looking at things. It's not just people getting together in a room and saying, well, let's make this the law. It's real world circumstances over the centuries developing a rule that actually works in real life. I think that's the value of the common law system.
The McNaughton test is the insanity defense in the United States. The insanity defense in Canada goes like this. No person is criminally responsible for an act committed or an omission made while suffering from a mental disorder that rendered the person incapable of appreciating the nature and quality of the act or omission or of knowing that it was wrong. So very similar, but you see, first you have to show that you have a disease of the mind, and then you have to show that it rendered you incapable of appreciating the, quote, nature and quality of the act. Now, Canadian law establishes a presumption of sanity, which the defense must overcome. This is interesting because of the two-parter. It can't just be all of a sudden I now suffer from a mental disorder that prevented me from knowing what I was doing. You have to actually show that you had the disease of the mind and that it incapacitated you.
And one thing I'm interested in, and if you're a Canadian lawyer, I would be interested to hear from. In the United States, we have something that's called temporary insanity. It's sort of the boogeyman of every overdramatic law show where the person claims they were temporarily insane during the crime, therefore not guilty by reason of insanity, but because it's temporary, now they're perfectly fine and they can just be released. And so they suffer no consequences whatsoever for the crime. They don't even have to go to a hospital and be treated. It was temporary insanity. And I wonder if in Canada you can do that because of this whole notion of showing that you suffered from a mental disorder. To me, that would seem to require a little bit more than some sort of temporary insanity thing. I mean, maybe not. Maybe it's just a little bit more narrow than it is in the United States. But if you're a Canadian lawyer, I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on that, and we will share them with our fans in a later episode. And here's the thing, though. And it's, one thing that's interesting. One more thing on the United States and the McNaughton test. There was a period where, and we talked about this before, in the sort of middle of the 20th century, everybody decided they didn't really like this whole common law thing. We want things to be more structured and uniform across jurisdictions. This is where the sentencing guidelines came from, for instance. It's where a lot of the model codes, those of you who are lawyers, there's the model penal code and the uniform commercial code, right? There was this notion of we're going to pass codes and replace all these common law things. And in many cases, that didn't work, and they've essentially gone back to the common law. And one of those places was insanity. So in the middle of the century, the United States changed the insanity defense to make it a little bit easier, actually, for defendants to use. You didn't necessarily have to show that you had no idea that something was right or wrong. You could just show, I think it was by propensity of the evidence, that you had some sort of mental defect that stopped you from appreciating what you were doing, and maybe that was enough. And then John Hinckley attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan, and he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and everybody got angry. They all were flipped out about it because they didn't like the fact that you could attempt to assassinate the president and then claim you're insane, and it worked. Now, Hinckley has been in a medical facility for a very long time since, but that caused us in the United States to go back to the McNaughton rule and sort of abandon this new rule for the tried and true.
I hear a sweet voice.
I do too.
Oh, so sweet.
But either way, in both the United States and Canada, if you are found to be insane, you cannot be held responsible for the crime, and you cannot be punished for it. There's a famous case out of England where a ship captain decided in the middle of the voyage that his men were conspiring against him to commit a mutiny. And so he basically took a hatchet and murdered the vast majority of his crew, and then sailed into the harbor and was like, I killed a bunch of mutineers, right? And everybody was obviously disturbed by this, and it turned out there was nobody conspiring against him. You know, he told them that like God told him they were conspiring against him. Very clearly insane. So they go to trial, and he's found not guilty by reason of insanity. No, initially the jury wants to return a verdict of guilty but insane. And the judge says to them, you can't do that, because if you're insane, then you can't be guilty. Guilty implies a malicious mind. It implies intent to do something wrong. So he's either guilty or he's not guilty because he's insane, and he actually was found. They returned then with a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. So if you are found to be insane, you cannot be held responsible for the crime, and you cannot be punished for it. Now, that doesn't mean you just go free. You can be confined, and oftentimes you are sent to a mental facility until such time as you're no longer a danger to society. So, going back to what we were talking about with temporary insanity, if you are truly temporarily insane at the time of the crime, and by the time of the trial you are perfectly sane, then you would be released immediately. You wouldn't be sent to the hospital. If you're no longer a danger to the community, if you're sane, and if you're not guilty by reason of insanity, then you're not guilty, and you get to leave.
And so this leads to the question, how do you decide if someone suffered from insanity under the law? Well, the trial here became a battle of the experts. Dr. Lisa Ramshaw testified for the defense. She said, quote, "It is my opinion that more likely than not, Sean was suffering from a mental disorder at the time," said Ramshaw. "He was rendered unable to understand the wrongness of his behavior." Ramshaw stated that Sean suffered from delusional disorder, an illness that would have allowed him to seem perfectly normal with most people, as long as he did not believe they were part of a conspiracy against him.
And this is a very nuanced diagnosis, right? Because it prevents the prosecution from putting on a bunch of people who say, he seemed perfectly normal to me. I never thought he was insane. You know, we went out and had beers and you know, laughed and talked about girls and watched movies, right? Because what she's saying is, yeah, that's exactly what he would do. He would appear perfectly normal to you. It's only the people that he believes are in a conspiracy against him, the ones who are trying to ruin his life, much like McNaughton. McNaughton believed it was the prime minister who was doing that. A very similar situation of what she's trying to set up here, that you're only going to see this if you are the target of that. And in fact, that's what Carina would be. And it actually makes those other witnesses hurt the prosecution. Because if they put on a bunch of witnesses who say, he seemed fine, he seemed sane, I didn't see it, right? That just bolsters what they're saying. Of course, he seemed perfectly fine, but a perfectly fine person wouldn't have committed this brutal crime against Carina. Obviously, he has some sort of mental illness that makes him fixate on her in a way that is different from the general populace.
So this was a very good strategy for the defense. And some of you may be thinking, how can you possibly counter that? What could the expert for the government say if basically you're saying, he looked fine, he could look fine, but it was just the object of his obsession that he thought they were conspiring against him. They would bear the brunt of it. Well, Dr. Angela Carter testified for the government, and she stated that although Sean had evidence of personality disorder, she disagreed with the diagnosis that he was delusional, stating that he showed signs of malingering. She said that in her opinion, Sean had an awareness of right and wrong and was not so mentally ill that he could not appreciate the morality of what he did.
And that really goes to the sort of bifurcated thing, the two things you have to show. I mean, the first thing is, you got to show he has a mental illness. And so she's basically saying, look, there's no question that Sean is suffering from some sort of mental illness, but he still understands the difference between right and wrong. And I hope you can appreciate how important that distinction is in the law. A lot of people suffer from mental illness. A lot of people struggle with some form of mental illness in their lives. Can be very serious, can be less serious, but it's something that for the people who are suffering from it, it is a burden on them, and it's something they have to overcome. It's something that often requires medication or treatment or counseling. What if every person who had a diagnosed mental illness essentially had almost a get-out-of-jail-free card where they could say, well, I have mental illness, so yeah, I know I robbed that bank, but mental illness, I can't be held responsible. And that's where this knowing the difference between right and wrong is so important, because it is almost empowering in a way. It's saying just because you have mental illness doesn't mean you can't live your life. It doesn't mean you can't be a functioning member of society and know the difference between right or wrong. And we're going to hold you to that standard. And I think that's really important when you're thinking about this, because you see some people think, for instance, I've heard James Renner say this. James has essentially said that anybody who kills somebody is obviously mentally ill, and we should treat them as mentally ill, and they shouldn't go to prison. They should go for treatment or something, which I disagree with James 100% on that. I could not disagree with him more, but it's something he believes. And even if it's true, though, assume for a second it's true. Assume that no person could, in cold blood, kill another person unless they have, to use the common parlance, something wrong with them, right? A screw loose in their head or whatever you want to call it. Under the law, that's just not enough. You got to show more than that. You got to show that when you did it, you did not realize that what you were doing was wrong. You're not just mentally ill, but you are truly insane at a deeper level. And I think that's a really important thing that this case illustrates in a really powerful way. One more thing I want to say on that, and we've ran into this a couple times, the battle of the experts. And once again, when you're deciding if somebody's guilty or not, you got to decide that beyond a reasonable doubt. So in a very real way, the question before the jury is Sean insane beyond a reasonable doubt? Which is a little weird, right? Because normally the defendant doesn't have to show anything. The defendant can sit silent and the other side has to prove that he's guilty. But in certain cases, when you have something like an affirmative defense, like for instance, you say, I was acting in self-defense. If that's your defense, you got to prove that. You got to put on some evidence to prove that you're acting in self-defense. Similar thing here. Remember, in Canada and in the United States, there's a presumption that you're sane. So you have to overcome that. You have to show that you're insane. You have to prove that you're insane. And we talk about reasonable doubt all the time. And people, I think, often get confused between reasonable doubt and all doubt. And Alice and I, when we do a trial, the last thing the judge says to the jury, he gives them instructions. So before the jury goes back, the judge talks to them about the law. He tells them what the law is, and then the jury's responsibility is to apply that law to the facts and make a decision. And one of the last things he says to them is, reasonable doubt does not mean beyond all doubt. So it doesn't mean that there's not lingering doubt in your head. Now, the definition of reasonable doubt can be really hard to figure out. Like, what does that mean? So if I have a doubt, how do I know if it's a reasonable doubt? I had a trial a couple weeks ago, and the attorney that I was trying the case with, at the end in his closing argument made a point that I thought was really great. I'm interested to hear what Alice thinks about this. He talked about reasonable doubt, and he said, it's doubt for which you have a reason. It's doubt where you can say, it's not just, well, I don't know if he's guilty. Like, that's the first step. I don't know if he's guilty. Why? Why don't you know if he's guilty? Well, I just have a feeling. That's not reasonable doubt. You've got to be able to assign something to it, a reason that is leaving you in doubt about this person's guilt. So with this, I mean, he's saying he's not sane. He did something crazy. It's hard not to have some doubt in your mind about his mental state. You can't read his mind. You can't be inside his head. But you can decide when you listen to the experts and you look at the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that he is insane.
By the way, I disagree. I disagree that being able to assign a reason is enough. I think we saw this a lot with the Darley case. A lot of people wrote in reasons and they would cherry pick the evidence and say, because of this one fact, I think she's innocent, when reasonable doubt has to be taken in totality. So I think all of us could name a reason for just about any viewpoint. Any viewpoint, you can find some reason to support it, but some reason isn't beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's just my rant of I think it's very clever, though, because it gives a roadmap to something that seems so amorphous, something so pie in the sky. What is reasonable doubt? So I think it's very effective of an argument for the defense. Those of you who are defense counsel might want to do that.
So I'm curious, what would you, if you were arguing before a jury what reasonable doubt is, what would you say?
I think what you've said previously is that it's the type of sureness that you have to make an important decision in your life. You typically don't make decisions with 100% knowledge of all the consequences, of all of the reasons going into it, but you are sure enough that you wouldn't hesitate to make a major decision in your life. These are not the small decisions in life, but a major decision, a decision to take a job, a decision to move somewhere, your daily affairs that are most important to you. If you are comfortable enough with that level of assurance, I think that is what you bring to reasonable doubt. And I think that's helpful because everyone probably has a different level, but then there's consistency within the person who's making that determination.
Oh, that's a really good point. And that is, I think, the best way to look at it. And if you think about it, think about the important decisions you've had to make in your life, whether to take a job, whether to buy a house, whether to go out with that guy who asked you out on a date, right? And these are important decisions and things that you have to decide. Just because you make a decision doesn't mean that you are 100% sure without any doubt whatsoever that this is the right thing to do. It doesn't mean that, right? Now, if it's a flip a coin situation, that's not good enough for a trial, right? Like, you need more than that. But I think most of us have faced a situation where we know the right choice. We know the right choice. We know what the right choice is. We know what we need to do. We're going to do it, but there's still lingering doubt in the back of our mind. And that doubt, that sort of residual doubt that you always have whenever you're doing anything important, that's the kind of doubt that you have to ignore and push away, or you can never make a decision, right? And you would never be able to make a decision in a trial unless you had, video of the guy do it, and he turns and he smiles at the camera and he says, "I'm Joe Blow. If I'm ever on trial, convict me," right? Like, you would almost need that. It's kind of like, I was thinking about this, it's kind of like Wheel of Fortune, if you ever watch Wheel of Fortune. And when you're watching Wheel of Fortune, you don't know, all you have is like the category. That's all you have. And then slowly but surely there's evidence of what the word's going to be. And that evidence is the letters that people are calling out, and letters are turning. And, maybe you start to have a feeling about what it is. At some point, you're thinking, dude needs to ask for an M, right? And he does. He asks for an M, and the M turns, and then you know what the word is. Now, you don't see all the letters, right? Like, beyond no doubt would be you cannot solve that puzzle until every single letter is turned. But once that M turns, you know what the word is. And I think it's a similar thing with reasonable doubt. If there's enough evidence that even if you don't have all the answers, even if you don't have all the letters, that is enough for you to make the kind of decision you have to make in trials like this.
Now, in the end, the jury sided with the government and found Sean guilty, but the defense's arguments clearly had an impact. Because rather than finding Sean guilty of the premeditated first-degree murder that the government asked for, the jury found him guilty of the lesser-included offense of second-degree murder.
Which is really interesting, right?
Absolutely.
Because all that stuff we just said about how if you're insane, you can't be held responsible at all, the jury was like, eh.
They kind of, and this is what's so interesting. People ask us, how could the jury do that? Here's the thing. The jury hears the evidence, and then when they go deliberate, that's it. Unless there's jury misconduct, like someone's racially biased or someone's been tweeting about it or reading news coverage about it when they shouldn't have, or talking to one of the witnesses, unless there's something like that, it doesn't matter how the jury reaches their decision. The fact that they reach the lesser included the lesser included offense of second-degree murder means that they kind of bought into the insanity defense, but only to some degree. Maybe they thought, well, the murder is so horrific, we can't just let him off completely. And they kind of split the baby in some senses, which the law allows them to do. They are the jury. They get to decide however they do it, whether they're right or wrong. They get to determine how they weigh the facts.
And I love this about the jury system. Some people hate this. I love this. I love the fact that we just spent 40 minutes talking to you about the pie in the sky view of what sanity and insanity is, how it's supposed to apply, what the law says, what the precedents say, what the common law says. And at the end of the day, the jury went back there and said, well, he's crazy, but he ain't that crazy. That's what they said.
And that's really what they said, right?
Yeah.
You're right. This is what I love about the jury. So often, I think the lawyers get lost in the reasoning, the precedents, and the arguments, and the best arguments, and the rules of evidence, and rules of everything. And at the end of the day, the jury of your peers is really just that. It's a gut feeling of what is fair and what is not. And juries get it. Juries get it right more often than not, in my opinion and in my experience.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful thing. I really do. I think life is not science, and we're not all scientists, and the law is not science, and we don't have a bunch of professionals deciding whether you're guilty or innocent. There's a real feeling in the law of this is a community and a society coming together to do the best they can, and a jury is sort of the ultimate embodiment of that, and I think that's what you see here. And frankly, I kind of think they got it right. I think he was not somebody who needed to go to a mental facility for a few years and receive treatment. I think he knew what he was doing was wrong, but I do think he had sort of an overriding paranoid mental illness that was affecting the way he looked at things.
Now, there are some additional unusual aspects to discuss. First, a juror's mental health. After the 4-month trial was over, just side note, I don't know how this took 4 months, to be honest. It was a pretty clear-cut murder. But anyways, it was a 4-month trial. One of the jurors, Mark Ferrant, found that he just couldn't leave the case behind. It haunted him to the point that he could barely function. He started carrying a knife with him whenever he would leave his house, and he would eventually sue the government of Canada for the effects of the PTSD he suffered from sitting through this case as a juror. And he later championed legislation to provide resources for jurors who serve on difficult trials. By the way, this is not that uncommon. There are some really good studies of the impact of particularly gruesome murders and offenses that jurors have to sit through and the effect that they have and the diagnosed PTSD they can suffer from it. Because, in true crime, we talk about these murders, but we don't put up the pictures. You're not seeing a lot of things that the jurors see, and they have to see it. They have to see it firsthand because they have someone's life in their hands. So there's no dancing around the subject with respect to the jurors. You see everything. A lot of people are not used to that. You don't see it on the news typically. You don't even see it in documentaries and movies. You see a pared down version of the evidence, but the jurors see it all, fully. And something as gruesome and as disturbing as this case, I can certainly imagine would have a lasting impact on a juror. Now, it's interesting that this had such an effect on him that it actually caused him to help change the law in Canada.
Yeah, and I think this is a great thing that the Canadian government has done and really should be done across the board. Got to remember, juries are just normal people. And even for Alice and me, I remember the first time I had a child pornography case. I remember my first death penalty case and seeing photographs of someone who'd been brutally stabbed to death, and it is deeply disturbing on a very fundamental level. And when you have your second and your third and your fourth, you start to, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on how you look at it, you become a little bit more used to seeing that kind of stuff, and it doesn't affect you as much. But remember, these jurors, they're coming in for one trial. They get summoned. They have no idea what trial they're going to sit on. It could be, jaywalking to a brutal multi-murder. And if it is a murder like this one, they're seeing the photographs. They're seeing the dead bodies. They're seeing the cuts. They're seeing close-up images of the wounds. And you can imagine how that would really affect people and could leave them with nightmares and paranoia. And I mean, just doing this podcast makes me paranoid. I can't even imagine if I was just Joe Blow off the street coming in to do my civic duty, and all of a sudden it's 4 months of this. So I think this is a great move by the government of Canada, and I'd love to see it happen more in the United States.
And Brett, there are some types of cases that I never get numb to, which I think is a good thing, but it also means that those particular cases are really hard for me. And I have nightmares. Some of my cases keep me up at night, even though I've done that type of case multiple times. It's because I think that these things are disturbing, incredibly disturbing, as they should be. If they weren't disturbing to us, then we would probably live in a scarier world.
Yeah, the first death penalty case I did was a guy and his best friend murdered his family, which included 2 little girls. One was 6 and the other one was 3, and they cut their throats with a kitchen knife. And the 6-year-old, while the friend is holding her down, is begging her brother not to do this, and he does it anyway. And it's like, I mean, a case like that, it's just, like you said, if there's ever a point where that doesn't affect you, you just need to quit. You just need to get out of it, because you're just, that in of itself is a kind of mental illness if you're not affected by that kind of thing. So yeah, this stuff can be brutal. And like I said, I think Canada did the right thing. I don't think most of these resources are available in the United States at all. And that would be a good thing for us to move forward on. So we said that Sean was convicted. Only second-degree murder, but nevertheless, he was convicted of murder. So he's going to serve a lot of time in prison. But that is not what happened. Sean may have been convicted, but he would not serve his sentence. In 2014, he was found dead in his jail cell, having committed suicide. He apparently hung himself. According to his lawyer, this was an outcome that was shocking, but not surprising. And I think you understand what his lawyer was saying there, that while it was shocking that it happened, there's almost a sense of inevitability with this, and just a tragedy all the way around. And this is how this case came to an end. And I think, to the extent you can put any kind of positive spin on this, I know that Carina is still remembered at Ryerson University. If you do any research on this case, you'll see that. And obviously the work that this juror did, Mark Farrant, to get these resources available for jurors is probably maybe one of the best things that came out of this. But a tragedy, in one, like I said at the beginning of all this, really implicates a lot of interesting things in the law that don't come up that often. The insanity defense is rare. In television, it happens all the time. In reality, very rare. Almost never happens. Very difficult. We talked about this a little bit in Britney Spears. Whenever you have a case that involves mental health and someone's ability to function in society, it is very difficult to figure out how to handle that and what the standard should be. And I think everybody involved in this case did pretty much the best they could.
It's a sad case all around. It's sad that Sean, killed himself. It's sad that all the people affected by this as well. Those, you remember, they lived in a communal house. All the people who witnessed this and tried to save Carina. It's just very broken and very sad. But this case actually brings us so many interesting legal issues. So we hope you've enjoyed that. And it has come up in some of our past cases, but never so directly.
And I'll say this, I think a couple things to take away from this case. The first is, if you find yourself in a relationship where the person you're with is trying to gradually close off your contact with your family and your friends, that is a relationship you need to step back from at least and look at. And I know it's really hard to do and it's easy to say, but it is such a common thing that happens, and it's something that happens very early on in these kind of relationships, because it's really the first step. The first step to controlling a person is cutting off their ties with others and making them dependent on you. That's the first thing you got to do. And once you have that, you're 90% of the way there. So if you see that starting in your life, I hope that you will take a step back and look at your relationship. And the other thing, his mom recognized that he was having some serious issues 5 years before this happened. And I realized she was in a difficult situation, and I'm not blaming her for what happened. But if you see this in people you love, do everything you can to get them help. Even the worst mental illnesses can be controlled, at least to some extent, with medication. The wonders of modern medicine have taken us a long way. And if nothing else, even if it can't be controlled, giving someone the help they need can not only save their life, but might save someone else's down the line. Well, we know this has been a kind of a heavy case, but an interesting one, and we want to hear from you what you thought. Shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com. Look us up on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram @prosecutorspod. Enjoy so much talking to you guys on social media. Those of you who are watching this on YouTube, hello. Look forward to your comments, even the mean ones.
You've controlled yourself very well.
I know, I have. If you're a patron, thank you so much for supporting us. I hope you're enjoying this show. If you're not a patron, join us on Patreon. Not only do you get ad-free episodes, but you also get Get Vocals with us, where we talk about these cases and talk about anything that you want to discuss. Before we wrap up, in just a couple weeks, September 25th, we will be in Savannah for the
Crime Expo. The Savannah Crime Expo is happening September 25th, and we are so excited to be there. And you know who else is going to be there, Brett?
Who else?
Cheryl McCollum.
Cheryl McCollum, who's awesome. Can't wait to see her.
And I will say this, for those of you who can make it out there, we are so excited. We got some new swag to give to you all for free, to our wonderful listeners. So if you come, you'll get some free swag that we are very nerdily excited about. We won't tell you what it is. You have to come and see it.
So excited. You got to come. You got to come to Savannah if you want to see it and get it. We will have plenty of it available. So make sure, if you're in Savannah, come by to see us wherever we're set up. If you're not in Savannah, go to Savannah for this great event. I missed out on CrimeCon, and I can't wait to see you guys in Savannah. Well, Alice, that is all we have for today. But we'll be back next week with a new case, new questions, and hopefully more answers. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors.
Like how that happened was, I never listened to the intercom because it's like loud on the plane and, and they were like talking and I guess I wasn't listening. And then all of a sudden we landed and they're like, nobody get out of your seats. And I was like, why? And they're like, because we're not in our destination city. And I was like, where are we? Is this like Lost? Like, you are somewhere new, completely in a different vortex. And like, no one told me where I was. I was like, where are we? anxiety about flying, and she had a therapy dog, and she was crying and throwing up. And I was like,
Oh, God.
yeah, I know. And I was like, you want to sit by the window? And she's like, no, I just want to be off of here. I was like, okay, I'm sorry.
Shopify is a platform built for growth, whether you're just starting out or already running a thriving business. From managing inventory to creating a seamless checkout experience, Shopify is designed to handle it all. And it doesn't stop there. Shopify helps you sell everywhere your customers are, online or in person. It's the ultimate tool for turning big dreams into big wins. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/OPP,